All right, thank you all for being here. It is my pleasure to introduce my colleague, Dr. Caroline Montojo, who is our guest speaker today from the Kavli Foundation. She is a senior science officer at the Kavli Foundation. This is, by the way, a piece of paper that was a bio that I printed about Caroline, and I crumbled it up because I realized I've known Caroline a long time, since we were both students, so I think I'm just going to kind of give you a little bit more of a personal introduction on her background. I do know she got her bachelor's degree at Berkeley, so we're fellow UC alums as well. But we met in graduate school. You were both Ph.D. students at Johns Hopkins, where we first met. And I remember this very vividly. I think you were the only person in our class to come in with an NSF graduate fellowship before actually enrolling into the program. I was so jealous. At that very moment, I remember that very, very vividly. But Caroline has been, she's one of the most brilliant people I've known. And I've known her a very long time, but we kind of got disconnected a little bit over the years and just reconnected recently by virtue of just the nature of what we both do. And I wanted to give you a little bit of background on her. So the work that she did back at Hopkins during her Ph.D. degree was really focused on working memory and looking at different systems in the brain that underlie working memory. This was work that she did with Sue Courtney. And then she moved and did a postdoctoral fellowship at UCLA, where she shifted interests a little bit and started working on psychiatric illness, which is actually one of my passions also, one of the areas that we haven't yet connected about, but we will at some point. And then she moved on to work for the Kavli Foundation, and now she's Director of International Brain Initiatives for the Kavli Foundation. And one of the things that you'll hear about from Caroline today is that this is a really, really exciting time to be in neuroscience. And I really wanted her to give this talk about what the future of neuroscience really holds. The last panel that you heard from, the speakers that you heard from, focused on different approaches and different questions and different areas in which we need to expand. But I think Caroline's perspective on this will be really what is actually happening? What is the support system that's available? What is the need? And what is the call to action? So I'm very, very excited, and I'm very delighted to welcome my old friend, Caroline Montojo, to the stage to give a talk.
Thank you. And thank you very much, Mike, for that introduction. I was a little worried when you crumpled up that piece of paper. So I would just like to thank the organizers of the International Conference on Learning and Memory, Mike and Manuela Yassa, for inviting me to speak today. Congratulations on such a successful conference. I've really enjoyed all of the discussion and the dialogue, particularly this Future of Neuroscience panel that just took place. You'll see here that the background slide is a tribute to the keynote lecture from Edvard Moser yesterday. Very excellent explanation of all of those concepts, and of course a tribute to your seminal research on grid cells. So my talk is a bit different from many of the other talks you've heard during this conference, but I think that the Future of Neuroscience panel set up what I'll be talking about very well. I also realized that this talk is the only thing standing between you and the welcome reception. So I will work to keep my remarks brief. So just to start, I'd like to give an outline of my talk. I'll be first briefly talking about the Kavli Foundation, the Kavli Institutes, and our igniting and catalyzing activities. I'm then going to give an example of our catalyzing activities through our work helping scientists to develop ideas for the US Brain Initiative. I'm going to talk about our efforts to help them build the US Brain Initiative in terms of the ideas. I'll talk about the strengthening of the initiative in terms of funds and scientific advances. And I'm also going to talk about some examples of our sustaining efforts to help the Brain Initiative to continue to move forward. And after that, I'll talk about our more recent efforts to build an international brain initiative. So for those who are not familiar with the Kavli Foundation, our mission is to advance science for the benefit of humanity and to increase public understanding of science. We have two flagship programs that support these two aspects of our mission. One of those is the Kavli Institutes, which I'll talk briefly about. The other is the Kavli Prize. one important aspect of the foundation is that we provide support for science internationally. We are an intrinsically international foundation. One example of this comes from our Kavli Institutes, of which we have 20 around the world. Our institutes are endowed in perpetuity, and we encourage them to pursue early-stage, high-risk research, which I know is a topic that came up multiple times in just the past panel discussion. We have two institutes in theoretical physics, 6 in astrophysics, 5 in nanoscience, and 7 in neuroscience. And in addition to our Kavli Institutes, Kavli also ignites and catalyzes. So what do I mean by this? Well, there are many steps to go from an idea to a scientific discovery. And one component in that trajectory are the funding bodies that enable hypothesis testing and experiments to take place. So Kavli, this includes government bodies, including OSTP, DOE, NIH, NSF, other federal funding agencies, private foundations, industry, and universities. And Kavli fits into this box, but we also contribute to this framework in other ways. One of those is by helping to ignite ideas, by supporting scientists to explore frontier, out-of-the-box ideas, primarily through our meetings program. Another way is that we sometimes catalyze these ideas. One thing we try to do is try to actively listen to the scientific community. And if we hear from multiple members of the scientific community that there's a critical gap or opportunity facing the field as a whole, then what we do is we can act as conveners and facilitators. And in that perspective, we bring together diverse stakeholders who have common interests in a particular problem and explore the best path to support those ideas. And one concrete example of these catalyzing activities comes from our work to help support scientists to build ideas for the US Brain Initiative. So we capitalized on the different mechanisms of our science programs that we use to help support science. As you can see here, we have several mechanisms of support, including the Kavli Institutes, ranging to the Kavli Meetings program, to our collaboration with the National Academies of Science, with their Frontiers of Science program, and the Scientific Societies collaborations, where we support distinguished lectures at these scientific societies. And so how exactly did we help in supporting the US Brain Initiative's development? Well, in September 2011, we gathered scientists, many of which came from our nanoscience and neuroscience institutes, to gather at the Kavli Royal Society Centre just outside of London to explore opportunities at the interface of nanoscience and neuroscience. It was at this meeting that the idea of the brain activity map was born. And this idea was very central in the scientific thinking that inspired the Brain Initiative and was a major catalyst in its launching. Over the next 18 months, we continued to convene meetings between scientists and the various stakeholders who are interested in thinking about the future of neuroscience. And one of those meetings took place at the Society for Neuroscience, which is one of the scientific societies that we provide support for. And then 18 months later, after that first meeting in September 2011, the Brain Initiative was announced by President Obama. He described it as the next great American project, the Brain Initiative. This seeks to revolutionize our understanding of neural circuits, and in particular by doing this through the development of new neurotechnologies. There are many public and private partners in this collaboration, and many of these partners that you see here were also present at those early meetings as the ideas for the Brain Initiative were developing. And now I'd like to talk a little bit about the strengthening of the Brain Initiative. The initiative has been lucky enough to enjoy strong scientific leadership and vision, strong funding and bipartisan support, as well as many scientific advances that are now emerging as a result of multidisciplinary collaborations. From the scientific perspective, after the Brain Initiative was announced, Francis Collins, the director of the NIH, appointed a committee of scientists to help to develop the vision for the Brain Initiative. He appointed Corey Bargman and Bill Newsom as the co-chairs of this advisory committee, and them, along with a group of scientists, helped to create this Brain 2025 report over the course of about a year. And if you haven't read this yet, it's a very interesting read, and I would encourage you to look online to go ahead and read it. One of the suggestions in this document was that the first 5 years of the Brain Initiative would emphasize technology development, and the second 5 years would emphasize discovery-driven science. The idea here being that the tools and technologies developed in the first 5 years of the initiative could then be used by scientists to interrogate new topics, new questions. This idea that a rising tide lifts all boats. From a funding perspective, the initiative has been enjoying strong funding and bipartisan support. Just in December 2016, a law was passed called the 21st Century Cures Act. This ensures the NIH Brain Initiative budget for the next 10 years for a total of $1.511 billion. And it also received strong bipartisan support. In Senate, the vote was 94-5 in favor of the act, and in the House, it was 392-26 in favor of the act. This is what the funding through the 21st Century Cures Act looks like from 2017 to 2026. You can see that there's quite a bit of fluctuation over the years. This will be complemented by annual appropriations funding on a yearly basis. You will notice also that 2023 looks like an especially good year. So start thinking of those great ideas now. This is what total Brain Initiative funding looks like. So you'll see this is across the US federal funding agencies. Note that 2019 values are still very preliminary and are expected to increase. And just last week, I was at the US Brain Initiative Investigators meeting in Bethesda. And it was there that representatives of the NIH shared that the projected total funding from NIH for the lifetime of Brain is $4.9 billion. This is just from NIH alone. And the NIH Brain funding through 2017 is at the level of $548.3 million. This is only 11% of the total projected budget for the Brain Initiative. This means that the Brain Initiative is just starting. And so there's a lot of room for expansion and advances ahead. The Brain Initiative has had a great deal of diversity in disciplines. We just heard from the panel ahead of this talk that we're incorporating many, many fields into the initiative. This is critical for the development of new tools. In fact, in 2016, of the 576 NIH grants, more than half are from PIs outside of neuroscience. This is critical for thinking about how to develop new neurotechnologies, particularly hand in hand with neuroscientists. The hope is that this diversity isn't going to plateau now after the first 5 years of the initiative, rather that even in the second half of the initiative, there will still continue to be new tools and technologies that are created or improved upon. There have been many key scientific findings. As of today, there are over 340 publications that have emerged from NIH-funded publications to date. And this doesn't reflect NSF, DARPA, IARPA, other agencies and private organizations that are funding the Brain Initiative. And so this brings us to the next phase. As I mentioned earlier, the concept was that there would be 2 phases of the initiative. We find ourselves now celebrating the 5th anniversary of the initiative, which places us right in this category. And so with that, the NIH recognized that this is an opportune moment to revisit that Brain Initiative strategy that was composed at the beginning, to plan the next phase of the initiative, and also to explore topics and questions that are now possible with the emerging tools and technologies that have been developed. And so they're appointing a new advisory group to the NIH director. This is the new Brain Initiative Working Group, this time co-chaired by Catherine Dulac and John Monsell. And you can see, you may recognize many of the names list as well. One of the pieces of information I will bring back to you from the Brain Initiative Investigators meeting last week is that they are inviting comments and questions for this Brain Initiative Working Group. So this is your opportunity then to offer your thoughts on this next phase of the initiative. Last week, they had the first public town hall to start accepting and answering some of these questions, and they also this working group met for the first time. So it's really just getting started. And there's a lot of opportunity for community feedback. All right, now I'd like to turn to some of the Kavli efforts in helping to sustain the US Brain Initiative. I'm only mentioning 2 examples here, but there are other activities that we've been pursuing to try and listen closely to the community as challenges arise, and then try and figure out ways to address those challenges. So the first I'm going to talk about is the Brain Initiative Alliance. After the Brain Initiative was announced, several members of the scientific community came to us and told us that one of the challenges, one of the bottlenecks of the initiative was that it was hard to find information about it. There wasn't a single clearinghouse, a one-stop shop of information that scientists or the public could go to try and find information about this initiative. You'll see that when the Brain Initiative was first started, there was just a handful of private, nonprofit organizations and federal agencies that were involved in and participating in funding the Brain Initiative. And then in 2014, other sectors, other organizations from industry, state, and university joined in, as well as others from private and public sectors. And then by 2015, more joined. This was a wonderful display of support for the Brain Initiative, but it also created a very distributed set of organizations that were supporting it. It was very hard for scientists, especially those coming from fields outside of neuroscience, let's say those who have never applied to an NIH grant, to find this kind of information distributed across so many different areas. And so it was at this time that members of the community came to us and identified the need for some kind of an alliance to centralize all this information and to bring the different organizations together. So, from 2015 onward, the Kavli Foundation started convening meetings with these different stakeholder groups. And in 2016, we established what's called the Brain Initiative Alliance. These are the core partners who helped to establish this alliance, and now we have participants coming from the various stakeholder groups as well. And one of the first things we sought out to create was a website, right, to disseminate all of this information. And here at this website, you can find everything from news to events to achievements, and importantly, funding opportunities. There are funding opportunities available. This is critical, and it comes from across the different agencies that are supporting the Brain Initiative. All right, and now I'm going to talk about another example of our sustaining efforts. Another piece of information that we were hearing from the community is that despite all of the advances that were coming from the Brain Initiative over the past 5 years, you saw those 340 publications from NIH, that there wasn't really an efficient way to disseminate, to get across all of these advances to the public, especially policymakers and their staff who are so crucial to making these kinds of funding decisions for science. And so, with this in mind, we started consulting with some folks in the community, as well as folks on Capitol Hill, to understand, well, what could be a useful way to approach this? And so just last Thursday, our team here was in DC on Capitol Hill. We went to the Capitol Hill Visitors Center to hold the Brain Fair. We wanted this to be an interactive, informal event where we could really bring the science of the Brain Initiative to life. And so we brought scientists who were funded by various Brain Initiative partners to Capitol Hill to share their science in creative ways. We even had science museums participating in this to help think of ways to make their science exciting and creative. And it was a really fantastic event, and we were fortunate to have the support of the Congressional Neuroscience Caucus. This is co-chaired by Representative Kathy McMorris-Rogers and Representative Earl Blumenauer, who really helped to partner with us in putting on this event. We had many co-hosts as well, including the American Brain Coalition, the Society for Neuroscience, and the Simons Foundation. We were also fortunate to have several speakers at the event, including France Cordova, who's the director of NSF. We had Josh Gordon, director of NIMH, and Walter Korschetz, director of NINDS, present. So it was a really fantastic event, and I think a lot of people started to get a flavor of what's happening with the Brain Initiative. And so one thing that I'd like to do right now is show you a 3-minute video that we debuted just last week at the Brain Fair. And I think that this really captures the essence and the spirit of what the Brain Initiative is about. So I hope you enjoy it.
architect and engineer sit down and design a communication system, plumbing, air conditioning, all of that. In the brain, we're actually trying to reverse engineer that in a way. We actually don't have the blueprint.
Possibly the most complex entity in the entire universe. There's microarchitecture, nanoarchitecture, macroarchitecture, and then there's the function of the brain, which we observe in everything we do when we interact.
As humans, we have this intellectual curiosity about what makes us different. It's all related to our brain circuits. Getting the tools to allow us to see circuit activity in action and apply it to problems that no one's been able to solve before would be a tremendous advance.
We all have a brain, and we want to understand that brain better. Get the scientists from different communities, different cultures, different emphases together. They'll start forming their collaborations organically. To do that type of sharing, you don't need a big bureaucracy. You don't need a lot of complexity. You just need to talk to each other.
No one person, or even small number of people, have the expertise in terms of anatomy, physiology, computation, theory, mathematics. We can all act synergistically to come to a better model of what's going on.
Every one of us have been touched either directly or indirectly by mental conditions. And the fact that we don't have answers for a lot of these things, we don't know how to cure depression, we don't know how to treat Alzheimer's, we don't know how to deal with post-traumatic stress disorder. When you have diversity in a group, you would take in the advice, experience, expertise from others, and that, I think, at the end will end up enriching whatever you're trying to build.
Brain Initiative combine the science and engineering together to develop the tool which can impact the neuroscience community, interrogating the signal connectivity, how the single neuron will be connecting to the next neuron, how memory is being really formed and retrieved, deeply understand the last frontier of our mystery of the brain.
For researchers, oftentimes there's questions of funding, there's questions of relevance, and foundations can say, we're committed to this work because we're doing this work. We're putting our mouths where our money is and our money where our mouth is.
If we as a government don't fund basic science, who's going to do it? Better outcomes for patients and for all of us, whether you are diagnosed with a disease or not. It's going to save us a lot in the long run as far as healthcare costs.
Let's get all the stakeholders, industry, government, academics, lawyers, doctors, people from all parts of life, and let's come up with a structure to help people in the greatest need.
What would happen if we put this and that together? If it actually worked, it could really advance things. And in terms of the research that we do in neuroscience, I think the Brain Initiatives enabled that kind of high risk, high reward.
We should just get people together to pursue this goal that is much greater than any one of us individual professors or scientists. What could be more interesting than understanding what the ingredients to consciousness are? That's our vision.
All right, I hope that you enjoyed that video. All right, and so going into the last portion of my talk, I'd like to say a little bit about a more recent effort that we've been helping to build, along with many, many other partners from around the world. And I actually think that this section of the talk is so closely relevant to much of the discussion that happened during the Future of Neuroscience panel, and I'll go over some of those topics here. So, as many of you are aware of, there has been an emergence of global brain projects over the last few years, since 2013. We have, of course, the US Brain Initiative, the European Commission-based Human Brain Project, the Japan Brain Minds Project, and the Israel Brain Technologies, which is also forming their own organization to think about becoming a technology hub. But in addition to those, there's also been several countries that are planning to launch their own brain initiatives. This includes Korea with the Korea Brain Initiative, the Australian Brain Alliance is planning to launch their own, the China Brain Project, the Canadian Brain Research Strategy. With the establishment and the emergence of these various brain projects, one of the concerns that we've been hearing from the scientific community is that there's a need for better coordination and collaboration among these various initiatives, that this kind of coordination can maximize impact and efficiency and reduce potential redundancies that can emerge across the different initiatives. And so the Kavli Foundation, in collaboration and close partnership with several other organizations, especially the National Science Foundation, which received a congressional mandate to foster a meeting to better coordinate and understand the collaborative opportunities between these various brain projects, as well as the US State Department, also in collaboration with our Kavli Institutes at Columbia, Johns Hopkins, and Rockefeller. We've been convening a set of scientific and high-level meetings. The first started in April 2016 at Johns Hopkins at our Kavli Institute there. We had a global brain workshop, which brought together about 70 scientists from around the world to start the very first step of thinking about what could be a grand challenge for neuroscience if we have all of these different brain projects emerging. We then, a few months later, at Rockefeller University, held the Coordinating Global Brain Projects Conference, and this was headed by Corey Bargman and Rafa Yuste. This meeting had over 400 participants coming from multiple sectors, science, academic sector, industry, federal funding agencies, and government, from more than a dozen countries to explore what is happening around the world and also what are some of the collaborative points across these different projects. We've also had some high-level meetings. So on the same day as that Rockefeller conference, we went to the UN during the UN General Assembly and had a high-level dialogue there that was moderated by NSF Director Franz Cordova. We had representatives from Japan, Argentina, Germany, as well as the UN Council for Trade and Development, as well as the US State Department. We've also had several publications, also documenting some of the dialogues that have happened across these meetings. And so we've continued to convene meetings since 2016, but one major step for the International Brain Initiative took place just this past December, just a few months ago, in Canberra, Australia. The Australian Brain Alliance and the Australian Academy of Sciences held a workshop called the Brains at the Dome Workshop. The name of their headquarters for the Academy is the Shine Dome. And it was at that meeting that global brain project leaders got together and presented on their various brain projects and the scientific directions. And after talking about the importance of coordination and collaboration across the different initiatives, they felt inspired to publicly declare their commitment to working together. This was so important for the initiative because before this time, the projects were meeting together but not really coming to an agreement that we need to get this done now. And so this was very important. And one excerpt from that declaration is that the global brain initiatives recognize that they are engaged in an effort so large and complex that even with the unprecedented efforts and resources from public and private sectors, no single initiative will be able to tackle the challenge to measure, map, image, model, simulate, understand, imitate, diagnose, and heal the brain. And so, the world's brain initiatives have started to move forward. We had our very first kickoff call in January, but actually, right after that Australia meeting, we reached out to some of the countries that have brain projects who weren't present at that meeting. So China, Israel, as well as Canada. And so now the countries and regions participating in this initiative are Australia, Canada, China, Europe, Israel, Japan, Korea, and the US. There's been quite a bit of support for the initiative as well, coming from multiple different countries. And now the hard part begins, which is building the working groups. Fortunately, over the different discussions that were happening since 2016, several of the ideas were already floating to the top in terms of high priorities. So even predating the Declaration of Intent, we've started to work and get together on the working groups already. Some of the high priority topics that have been identified are an inventory of global brain projects, neuroethics, data sharing, tool and technology dissemination, education and training, public engagement and outreach. These are all common areas that face the various brain projects. And rather than reinventing the wheel each time for each one of these topics, it's in the best interest of the community to make sure that we're tackling these in a way that really maximizes the impact. Another central idea for the International Brain Initiative is this is not meant to be a top-down effort. The idea that engagement, close engagement with the scientific community is going to be really critical for developing the strategy and the core ideas that go into any of these working groups was central in the upstart of the initiative. And so with that in mind, for the inventory of global brain projects, we have a couple of leaders for this working group already. It's Melina Hale from the University of Chicago, Patrick Hoff from Mount Sinai. They just received funding from the National Science Foundation to convene the first meeting of scientists from all over the world this coming July at the National Academies of Science to start thinking about what are the critical pieces of information that should be included in an inventory. The goal here is to examine and catalog the initiatives systematically to understand what the funding amounts are, funding sources, the timelines, the objectives, as well as specific deliverables and points of collaboration. And so they'll be developing that along with scientists directly from the community. Another working group that has already started is one in neuroethics. This is a topic that I think has been mentioned multiple times throughout this conference. And so we have a working group leader, Karen Rommelfinger, who is the director of the Center for Neuroethics at Emory University. She's also a member of the Brain Initiative's Neuroethics Division of the Multi-Council Working Group. And she already started a meeting last October in October 2017 to bring together folks who are thinking about neuroethics across the various countries, the different brain projects, to create a universal list of questions that could be asked by researchers in any of the brain projects. And so this is really critical because if we think about the kinds of training that many of us in neuroscience have gotten as we were going through graduate school, thinking about modules like responsible conduct and research is the extent to which we really discuss these. But what they're already planning on doing is they are preparing a paper for publication in Neuron as a perspectives paper to talk about some of these questions that have already arisen so that there can be a dialogue that starts within the scientific community already. And they're also planning a follow-up meeting this coming October to bring in the various brain projects so they can each publish their own sets of papers that tackle neuroethics questions that are specific to each of those. And we have these other working groups which are still in the process of starting. And so one critical piece of this whole initiative is engaging with the science community. And so what we've started doing is going to the various scientific meetings that have been happening across the country, also across the world. That brings me here today. We have the International Conference on Learning and Memory. It's an opportunity to engage directly with the scientific community, but also to start gaining feedback. We want to hear what your thoughts are, because you are the experts in these areas. We're going to be at FENS in Berlin, as well as at the Society for Neuroscience this coming November in San Diego. And so with that, I'd also just like to mention that we're going to be setting up a website to better disseminate this information and also to gather feedback from the community. And so that brings me to my close. It takes the world to understand the brain, and I heard a lot of the points that were made in the panel prior to this, which I've been writing down and thinking about as you've all been mentioning it. And so I'd just like to encourage you to continue to offer your feedback. I will be here during the reception along with several other members of the Kavli Foundation that are here with me today. And I'd just like to thank you for your attention.